I'm in many ways just a preposterous messenger for the message of my book, right? I spent my whole life, celebrating capitalism and the free market, and now I'm talking about that our highest and best destiny is to kind of to at least gradually graduate from it.
Call this segment the final five. These are just 5 rapid fire questions just to give folks more of an understanding of you rather than the issues we talked about. So here we go. The first question. What's a completely non-political, non-intellectual hill you're willing to die on, and why does it matter so much to you?
Non-political, non-intellectual hill. Yeah. I've got goofy grammar Nazi kinds of fetishes that I will protect, but that fits in the intellectual realm. Um, uh, oh, uh, um, yeah, I'll be I'll be old and say that when that too much money and too much talent has made organized sports much less wonderful than they were when I was younger. That when athletes could smoke during halftime and sell used cars in the off season, that I liked that game better than this one. Where they get injured every other week because they're so strong and so fast that their collisions, bodies just can't put up with it. So I'll be a grumpy old man and long for the good old days of sports gone by. How about that?
Yeah, that old image of Len Dawson at halftime during the Super Bowl with a cigarette and a Fresca was iconic.
Yeah, fantastic. Yes.
I kind of get what you mean there. Okay, what's a piece of art, music, book, or film that consistently gets past all your intellectual armor and makes you feel something raw, disproportionate, or perhaps even a little embarrassing?
So Beethoven's Symphony Number 9. I discovered that when I was like 13 or 14. I was just taking German, and so I learned the words to the chorus in the choral finale at that time. And for a year or two, I would listen to it every single day, and so it's just in my soul. I listen to classical music while I work, just as kind of background music. But if that comes on, I have to make a decision. I'm either going to turn it off or switch to another station because or I'm just going to have to just spend the next 45 minutes closing my eyes and reliving that. And every few months, I will do that again. That one has total power over me.
Fantastic. That was a great answer. If someone makes a Brink Lindsey action figure, what accessory comes in the box? A policy memo, a contrarian essay, a half-finished manuscript, or just a complete look of disappointment?
What comes with him is an enormous library of books he's going to read someday.
Just huge unread library. Okay.
Yes.
What do you believe now, in the here and now, that perhaps your younger self would say, there's no way I would ever believe that?
So I'm in many ways just a preposterous messenger for the message of my book, right? I spent my whole life, celebrating capitalism and the free market, and now I'm talking about that our highest and best destiny is to kind of to at least gradually graduate from it. I'm in this book, I'm talking about the central importance of face-to-face personal relationships. And I'm an introverted bookworm who's now living 9,000 miles away from most everybody I know and care about. So I never in a million years, me 20 years ago would never have pictured me writing this book.
All right. Excellent. And the final question. If Milton Friedman and John Maynard Keynes were arguing at the bar and you had to buy a drink for one of them just to shut them up, which one and why?
Well, I had the pleasure of meeting Milton Friedman. It was at a conference in Mexico City, and actually we were going to a dinner, and we had to go on a bus to go to this someone's beautiful home. It was like an hour bus ride up into the hills, and I got to sit next to Milton Friedman, and I'd been at the Cato Institute for about a month, so I was in my 20s, and he was my idol, and I got to sit with him for a solid hour. So since I've checked that one off the bucket list, I'll talk up Keynes since I will take this advantage of time travel to go back and talk to him.